Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning. So on behalf of the Center for Leadership Ethics in the Eller House, how about a big round of applause to everyone for making it here today. So my name is Paul Melendez, and I serve as a University Distinguished Outreach Professor in the Eller College. I'm also the very proud founder of our Center for Leadership Ethics. For those of you who may not know, here in Tucson, Arizona, we have a center that is known internationally for doing not only cutting-edge research on organizational ethics, but also engaging in education at the undergraduate, MBA, and increasingly at the PhD level. We also do some really innovative outreach programs targeted at the K through 12, collegiate, and executive levels. Today's program is our executive level program, so we are really excited about today. I'd like to begin by thanking our generous sponsor, acknowledging our team which made today possible, and recognizing our guests, and of course, welcoming our panel. This symposium was made possible through the generous sponsorship of Zanes Law. Doug and Claudia Zanes are longtime friends to the Center for Leadership Ethics, and Doug is currently our acting chair of our center's advisory board. I'd like to acknowledge a few of my colleagues. Stacy Lester, where is Stacy? Stacy. Professor Michael Fricke. And of course, the fabulous Diane Sotelo. How about a big round of applause to all of them? The team that has made today possible. I'd also like to recognize our guests. Our guests are from the business, government, and nonprofit sectors. They're here both in person and they're joining us online as well. Our center's advisory board members. I'll start from my right here. Exequiel Rolón, we have Doug Zanes, we have Ron Sable, we have Irene Coppola, I believe we have Shane Mokata here as well, Bob Griffith, and then of course our emeritus status, we have Pam Krim as well. So a round of applause to all of our board members as well. We have faculty, staff, and students, not only from the Eller College, but also from main campus, which we are very happy to have. And then finally our panel. Exequiel Rolón from Peñoles is here today. We have Brian Scott from Vanguard. And of course, we have Jessica Uriegas with Ernst & Young. Round of applause to our panel, please. We have all the makings for just another wonderful symposium this year. But before I get started, I'd like to ask our chair, Doug Zanes, to please come up and offer a few words. Doug?
Good morning. Can everybody hear me? As Paul said, my name is Doug Zanes. I'm the current chair of the board for the Center for Leadership Ethics, and I've been part of the board for probably, I don't know, I guess about 10 years now. And you know, Paul's asked me to keep it to 5 to 7 minutes, so we'll see how that works out for Paul. But we'll give it our best shot. I just want to thank everybody for coming out today. We do this every year. And the idea behind it is, you know, Paul spends a huge amount of time coming up with a topic that he believes is relevant, that he thinks is interesting from an ethics standpoint, and then he, you know, kind of puts the program together and goes out and finds fantastic speakers to talk about that issue from different perspectives. And, you know, to me, as I thought about ESG as a topic, it's interesting to me because really it's been around forever. You know, but it used to be bits and pieces, right? We would talk about, you know, compensation transparency, compensation equality, you know, all of these different things over the years. You know, what companies should do when it comes to disposing of, you know, toxic waste. You know, that's an environmental piece. All of these things were sort of piecemealed out, and it seems like over the last 10 years with the advent of social media, it's gotten packaged up into ESG, which is really kind of a neat thing because I think it's brought a lot of awareness to it as a topic. But then it's created this, I don't know, sort of thing that's packaged up that can either be used as a tool to advocate for things that are really important, that are really necessary, but then it also can be used as kind of a weapon. You know, if you want to make something happen and you need something to drive it. And so it's all been packaged up in ESG, whether you talk about women's sports and the things that are going on with women's sports and who can participate in women's sports from a biological perspective. I think that would fall into the topic. Again, compensation. Glass ceilings existed in the 70s and 80s. And so I'm really interested in what you all have to say about the topic as it now exists, because it really is in that form, or in the form it's in, new. And it's all driven, or can be driven, by social media. And for those of you who are, let's say, 50 or older, which I fall in that category, I remember a time when social media didn't exist. Everybody who's, you know, probably a current student at the U of A has no idea of a time when social media didn't exist. And so with that in mind, you know, we're going to hand you off to the panelists, and I hope you guys have a great time today.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Doug. I appreciate your comments. I'd like to provide everyone with a little bit of a history on our symposium. I'd like to provide a high-level overview of what we mean when we talk about ESG. I think this is going to be really beneficial once we get into our panel discussions. Talk a little bit about today's format, and then I'd like to welcome to the podium our dynamic moderator, Professor Fricke. We started the symposium back in 2010 to explore a variety of topics, as Doug said, that we thought were emerging. We pride ourselves in the Center for Leadership Ethics for really leaning in on what I like to call thought leadership. So we've explored everything from socially responsible investing to the whole movement with benefit corporations. We've looked at AI, we've looked at cryptocurrency, and even last year we examined ChatGPT. The timing was impeccable because just a few months before OpenAI unleashed this on all of us. And this year it's no exception. You know, we're going to be looking at environmental, social, and governance. And one of the things that we're trying to do here with our panel and with our discussion today is to provide all of you with what I like to call fresh insights, best practices, and ultimately an ethical path forward for you to return to campus, to your offices, or home. What I'd like to do is give you a little bit of a backdrop on the history of ESG. As Doug said, it's not new. It may be newer in terms of the words that are put together, but it's got really kind of an interesting history. And for those of you that are here, that are a few of my former EMBA students, you might recall a little bit of this, but when I put some of this material together a couple of years ago, I realized you'd have to go back into the early 1900s. It was actually the Quakers' Friends fiduciary who decided early on to exclude sin stocks. You know, all those fun things like alcohol, tobacco, and gaming, you know, that just wasn't compatible with their values, and they viewed that as really creating a lot of harm to society. Fast forward to the 2020s is really when I believe this began to really gain traction, and when we saw this kind of convergence of ESG. The European Union taxonomy, which I know that Jessica is going to be touching on, came out with this really interesting classification of what they thought would be appropriate environmentally sound business practices. But really what they were doing, in my opinion, I'd love to get Jessica's take on this, is they were signaling to investors that greenwashing was becoming more and more of a concern. So this was somewhat of a barometer to help investors. Of course, we might all recall the murder of George Floyd. Why this is significant is because we saw an unprecedented degree of corporate support towards not only social issues, but a lot of issues relating to social inequity in society. And then, of course, we had COVID-19. And it was COVID-19 and the pandemic that really brought corporate governance into sharp view. People became very aware that the pandemic was not playing out equally in society. There's a lot of differences in how the pandemic affected people in society. So it didn't take very long for people to start questioning corporate boards. who's on corporate boards in terms of not just race and ethnicity, but also sex, which then opened up kind of a bigger discussion concerning what I always like to call stakeholder capitalism, right? This idea that firms are experiencing more pressure to not only deliver in terms of goods and services to shareholders, but also societal members, kind of taking this long-term perspective of creating value for the whole of society. So with that, what I'd like to kind of walk you through here are just a few descriptors of what we mean when we say ESG. So I'm going to start out first with the environmental pillar. And this pillar really focuses on carbon emissions, specifically the footprint that products will produce, the climate vulnerability that is associated with products, and then of course everything from toxic emissions to packaging materials to e-waste. It also involves natural resources, right? Biodiversity, the use of land, stress on water sources, and of course the sourcing of natural materials. It also presents some really interesting environmental opportunities for those of you who may not have noticed, right? If we're thinking a little bit about renewable energy, green buildings, and clean tech, these are where the opportunities rest for firms. Of all the three pillars, in my opinion, and I'll let our panel address this, I think this is probably one of the more complex. It's got a lot of moving pieces, and it continues to evolve every 6 months, it seems. The social pillar includes human capital, product liability, advance here, and social opportunities as well. So when you think of human capital, this is about health, safety, and the overall development of people. It's about labor management relations. It's about looking at your supply chains and trying to establish some standards. Product safety, of course, includes data privacy and security, but also product safety and quality and chemical safety. And then from an opportunity standpoint, when we think of social, this is about providing the public unique access to things like finance, communications, and healthcare. Okay? So that's the opportunity part of the social. And then, of course, with governance, what we mean by governance is we are talking about corporate governance, director behavior, and also governance opportunities. So corporate governance includes everything like ownership and control, but also increasingly of interest to people, executive pay, and kind of the overall firm's kind of tolerance for risks. Director behavior are things like corruption and bribery, any kind of anti-competitive practices, but also demonstrated ethics and compliance. From an opportunity standpoint for governance, it's a chance for boards to diversify their boards, transparency, and just this greater commitment to stakeholder capitalism. So when you look at ESG as a framework, I think it's pretty safe to say that it's about evaluating firms in terms of their policies, their practices, and their performance on these different measures, but also trying to assess how they're managing their risks, but also the part that I feel doesn't get talked about enough, how they're going to try to seize opportunities in the future, right, for competitive advantage. So it's a really fascinating framework. Right now, it's a very topsy-turvy time when it comes to ESG, right? I've often described to people that the pendulum has swung, and we're right at that point where the pendulum is swinging. A lot of leaders of firms right now have to decide, right, in an authentic way, what's your true north for ESG? Because the expectations of society are not going to relent, and the demands from investors are only going to get louder. So I think it's for this reason why today is really fitting, right? It's all about thought leadership, it's all about fresh perspectives, and giving you some additional insights and perspectives for when we leave today, for you to continue the conversations with everyone that you know. So with that, what I'd like to do is ask our moderator today, Professor Michael Fricke, who, by the way, was just recently promoted, so I think a round of applause is in order. I'd like to ask Professor Fricke to please come on up. He's going to be our moderator today, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. I'm going to stand over here. I break out this suit once a year. I can't stand behind a lectern. So very, very happy to have you all here. As Paul said, this is always a fun event for us. Just quick overview of kind of where we're going from here this morning. For the next hour or so, our panelists are going to each take about 15 or 20 minutes, talk through some prepared remarks, each on a different aspect of ESG and what they do. And then after roughly an hour or so, we're going to take a little break. Everyone can grab some coffee, use the restroom. During the break, and you can do this before the break, but as we're listening and then during the break, you notice on your table you have a little note card. If you have a question that comes up, a comment, something like that, please write it on the card. And during the break, we're going to collect those cards. And as you're all socializing, getting coffee, I'm furiously going to be working through all those cards, curating your questions. After we come back from the break, we'll have a little Q&A session. I'll be fielding, I'll be asking the questions, and our panelists will be fielding the questions. So as they're speaking, as questions come up, please write them down, and we'll collect those at the break, and then we'll come back, have the Q&A session after the break, and then a few wrap-up words from Paul, probably around 11 o'clock or so, and then some networking time after that. So that's the schedule for the rest of the morning. Like I said, we're super excited for this panel. I agree with Paul that this is such a timely topic. I don't know if you are aware of this. There's some political stuff going on in this country. And ESG is one of those things that's gotten wrapped up in all this political stuff. So one thing we want to do is just kind of get away from the politics of it and talk about what it means for our organizations, and kind of cut through some of that. And I know our panelists are going to do an amazing job with that. So without further ado, we're going to turn it over first to Exequiel Rolón from Peñoles. Exequiel, take it away.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Is it working?
Yeah, it works. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Paul. Well, I'm going to be talking about some social, environmental, and governance factors that are very important in the mining industry to build trust. And people often think of us in the mining industry as, well, what do they do? They do mining, but we're now in the business also of building trust to our stakeholders. So I will talk about some of these ESG factors that when you have good performance, that builds trust and that enables your business strategy. So I will talk about why all those things connect in the case of Peñoles, which is a century-old, or I would prefer to say century-wise company that has been producing minerals and metals and chemicals in Mexico for a long time ago. And we have a very long experience creating win-win relationships with our stakeholders. Peñoles is the world leader in the production of primary silver, that is the silver that you mine directly, but also is a very important player with Peñoles in the refined silver segment. We're also an important producer of zinc and a regional producer of lead and also refined gold. So it's a company, a very important company in Mexico, I would say, that has been there for a while and that has a very strong orientation towards its stakeholders. So interestingly, Peñoles did a spin-off and created Fresnillo. And that went into an IPO that was in London, because the Mexican stock exchange is relatively small, so it went to London. And that was a very, very fascinating story for a 100-year-old company that went to a different market and start playing with the regulations and the expectations of the UK. So that's something fantastic. But the company, at some point, decided to focus on ethics culture. And at the time, I was beginning working for Fresnillo, and that was my very first project, work on ethics culture. So we said, well, if the company does the right thing and takes into consideration the interest and consequences to the stakeholders, chances are that we're trusted and then we're able to execute our projects and continue operating. So we worked first with a company in London for our first program, and then we started working with the University of Arizona, with Professor Paul Melendez to develop the step-up culture. We wanted the people to be aware of not only acting ethically on their own, but we really wanted people to step up and see if there was something that we were not doing okay, step up and do something about it. So that effort permeated very well in the company, was very well accepted. We saw very interesting outcomes. And one of these outcomes was the creation of ethics ambassadors. So with the ethics ambassadors, we trained the rest of the organization on the ethics culture. But that's not enough. That's the cornerstone, the ethics culture, but then you need to implement some strict processes. So our colleagues start implementing processes to comply with regulations that we had in the UK to prevent bribery and corruption. So it was a first in Mexico to say, well, I'm going to implement due diligence, and people were, our suppliers were, this is new to us. No, we need to do this kind of background check in order to have a trust relationships. So we started introducing this kind of processes and re-educating and collaborating with our value chain, and then working on some other more complex regulations up to a point that we have a certification for having access to the international markets of precious metals. We certify that we introduce best practices in our value chain from our own production, but also the metallurgical complex purchases, mining products from other companies. So we make sure with this certification that we apply the appropriate controls to protect human rights and also to protect bribery, the environment, and so on. So that's how ethics has played an important role. And then it comes to tailings. The tailings have been one of the most sensitive issues of the mining industry. And there were some catastrophic events. So I would like really to go and make an effort to understand from an international perspective, what are the best practices? The president of the company wanted to protect communities, environment. So we started a big program looking for international partners, filling the gaps that we had in terms of the knowledge of our own infrastructure, and start adopting best practices of governance that require the intervention of experts that are independent from the company, dam safety reviews, and also build internal governance, how we built an engineering team with the knowledge of tailings, and how we made this responsibility with the accountability of the CEOs and the senior operations managers. So we start building all the governance, introducing best practices to monitor, to do the reviews. And rather than staying just trying to play with the arbitrage to say, well, maybe the Mexican regulation is below that, we didn't want to do that. We really want to have the trust of the communities, the trust of the regulators, and that inspired. Really, it was the president who said, we would like to do something excellent about this. But that's really how you connect the best practices with a president of a company that understands all these implications of the responsibilities of the company. And if we do that right, we're able to thrive. Then climate change. Climate change is interesting because when you have greenhouse gas emissions, they go to the atmosphere and they no longer belong to someone specific, but they really actually belong to the whole world. So it's related to the global citizen responsibility of the companies. And we say, okay, we have the UK that introduced, was among the first countries that introduced the mandatory reporting of carbon emissions, and more than that, the financial impacts of climate change in the company. So we said we need to do something about it because we're a mining company, we're not necessarily experts in climate change. So we found in the University of Arizona a fantastic partner. There was climate change information, but not at the right scale. So the university helped us to do high resolution modeling, and actually is helping us now to prepare the training for adaptation, how we train the people in the company to take into consideration what is going to happen with extreme droughts, extreme rainfall events, and start planning for the adaptation, especially for the new mines, the current ones, and more importantly, to the mines that we're going to close. Because if we close a mine, we would like those mines to be safe in perpetuity. So we need to understand the climate of the future, and the UFA has been a fantastic partner, helping us to develop those projections and training our people. But then it comes how we could reduce our emissions. So that's the most important part. We often get the questions of the investors, what about your targets, what are you going to do? And we're much more concerned about doing the right thing in the right manner than the external pressures of the stakeholders. Not necessarily the pressures, but we always want to understand the expectations and see how it fits with the business and how we can do it. So then we start working as a company a long time ago in the wind energy aspect in Mexico. So we have 3 wind parks. But the renewable electricity is not enough to decarbonize and to become net zero in 2050. So we start collaborating with NG Impact to develop a decarbonization roadmap. That is actually what are the levers that we can use in order to become net zero by 2050. What are the kind of opportunities that we can further pursue with renewables, but also how we can capture and store perhaps some of the emissions that are associated to the processes we have. So that's where we start saying, okay, it's an aspect of responsibility, but when we analyzed this, we realized that we needed extra capex, but the savings in terms of maintenance, because some of the electric vehicles are cheaper in maintenance, and the savings in fuels, and the savings in potential carbon taxes, all of that actually was a good business compared to, keeping the traditional technology. So it was from a consideration of the stakeholders, regulations, but then we figured out that decarbonizing for Fresnillo and Peñoles is going to be actually a good business. So that's how this aspect of climate change connected very well. And water. Water, we see the big impacts of water. In Mexico, we had droughts, and now we have floods in the same year. So one of the expectations is how we introduce processes in the mining industry that recirculate water. And those are very important when you plan for your mine. But then there are other opportunities. In the city of Torreón and the city of Fresnillo, our operations are nearby in Fresnillo and are in the middle of the city in Torreón. So we take the municipal wastewater, we do the treatment, and we use that for mineral processing and metallurgical processing. So it's about 5 million cubic meters per year that we take from municipal wastewater. And that reduces close to a quarter of our water consumption just by reducing the municipal wastewater. And an important aspect is how we collaborate with communities on water. Because if the communities have better access to water and we have better access to water, we have a win-win situation. And one of these fundamental moments for the company was the indigenous consultation of the Rarámuri people in Chihuahua. It was the first mandatory consultation in Mexico. Mexico signed an international agreement, but took almost a decade to start implementing this. And we were the first mining company that was required to do this. So an important decision of our leaders was actually, should we do it or should we find legal ways not to do it? But then there was a reflection, and the sensitivity of our CEO at the time was, if we are transparent about the impacts, how we intend to manage the impacts, what it means mining, what are the opportunities, and we actually are transparent and accountable with the indigenous people of how we're going to build a water reservoir, and we collaborate on projects with the community to also increase access, there are chances that we're going to be a trusted partner and that we can develop this project and with the support of the community. So we decided to build the capabilities inside the company to do the indigenous consultation, engage the community, be transparent, and actually got the consent of the community. But it was really a decision that, you always have the two options, but we said there's one option that builds trust and there's another option that might not build trust, and the senior leaders decided to build trust. when COVID came, things were very different in Mexico than in the US. In Mexico, vaccination was not as accessible as it was in the US, and the federal government was conducting the vaccination in Mexico, and there were very few collaborations between the private sector and the public sector in terms of vaccination in Mexico. So Peñoles was a trusted company, and the authorities came with Peñoles and said, well, it might be strategic that we vaccinate your workers, and we would be glad to help with that. But then the CEO of Peñoles said, I would like to vaccinate the community, and we're part of the community, so we would like to help in a process that would vaccinate the community, and we're part of the community. We don't want special treatment, but we rather would like to put our infrastructure in the service of the community. So our community center was transformed in a vaccination center. This was perhaps the most successful collaboration between the private and the public sector for vaccination in Mexico. So for more than a year, we spent all of our time in this facility, working with the authorities, and the community were really, really satisfied and trusting the company. We did the same with the Roramuri people in the mountains with Fresnillo, that we made transportation accessible for people from very small communities to go to the vaccination center, and that was also something that we did on a voluntary basis, but ended up building trust with the communities. So ESG, in spite of all the controversy, mining companies and other companies, and I would say every company, if it identifies those social and environmental factors that build trust, that are very important to have a good performance, this is very, very compatible with having the right support that enables your business strategy. So the values, the ethics, the business logic are all connected if the companies find a way to really do this with the right purpose. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Exequiel. Just a reminder, if you have questions that come up, write them down on your little card. I had a couple that came to my mind. So we're going to move right along to our next panelist, Brian Scott with Vanguard. Take it away.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you all for coming today. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Brian Scott. I am a senior investment strategist at Vanguard, and I thought the portion that I would speak to today was be related just to the investment environment and just kind of to contextualize the size of ESG and what it means to us. And so I have prepared some data, some slides that help walk you through that today. We talked about what ESG is, of course, and there's been a lot of ink spilled about ESG, about it being controversial, and I think it's been, the amount of attention it's received has been disproportionate to the size of the ESG market. And so those bubbles that you see at the top just show you the amount of assets in ESG investment products. And when I say investment products, I'm specifically referring to just mutual funds and ETFs. So this is admittedly only a portion of the ESG marketplace, because there's a large array of investment vehicles, or none at all, that aren't captured in this data, right? People might buy individual stocks and bonds. That's not included in this. Things like hedge funds and collective trusts and other investment vehicles wouldn't be included in this. And it's hard to get your hands around that data because there's less transparency. The mutual fund and ETF marketplace is very regulated, and so there's a lot more transparency on this data. And I think it's a pretty good reflection, though, of the size of the ESG market. And if you look at the size of the ESG market over the last 5 years, it's more than doubled, but it's kind of flat in the last few years. And that's in part because 2022 was a difficult year for the capital markets. The S&P 500 was down about 18%, so that'll take a little bit of the wind out of the sails in terms of the growth of the marketplace. But when you look at the number of products, which is the bar charts at the bottom of this page, there has been incredible growth. As you can see, it's almost tripled in size in terms of just the number of mutual funds and ETFs that are in the marketplace. So those are big numbers, right? It would be silly to talk about numbers in excess of $300 billion and say that's small. But when you think about the entire marketplace, It's almost $40 trillion of mutual funds and ETFs. So the ESG marketplace is less than 1% of the total investable assets in mutual funds and ETFs. But I think why this is getting a little bit more attention than maybe more plain vanilla investment vehicles is because it represents a preference. And if you're an individual investor that has a conviction and wants to invest in a manner that's aligned with your values, whatever those values are, that's one matter. But if you are an individual that's responsible for investing on behalf of others, it becomes a little bit more controversial, potentially, right? And I think one example I like to use, a little bit silly, admittedly, but when I was in college, I worked in an ice cream shop. And if you looked at the most popular flavors, there was things that you can probably guess: chocolate, cookie dough, vanilla, etc. Well, we always had some other flavors. We had butter pecan and blueberry chip. And every once in a while, somebody would come in and say, I would like the blueberry chip. But if you asked for cookie dough, and I said, no, you're gonna have blueberry chip, right? You'd rightly say, well, what are you talking about, right? So I think that's part of the reason why this has become a little bit controversial, especially because their standards of fiduciary care have evolved over time. And it's essentially, I think a good definition of it is defined in a law called ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, that was signed into law in the 70s. And it's really established a level of care by which stewards of other people's capital are to be held to, right? And one definition that it says is that you must act in the economic best interest of your clients without regard to other collateral benefits, right? And so that's one of the reasons why there's been more controversy and questions. If you're acting on your own behalf and you want blueberry chip, that's all well and good. But if you run a pension fund on behalf of firefighters, police officers, nurses, or if you're just a sponsor of a 401k plan or any other kind of retirement plan, and you're forcing that upon others who might have values that are different than yours without a clear economic benefit, that's where it becomes a little bit more controversial, right? And I think it's worth pointing out, sharing some other data. So just the types of ESG related vehicles, as you can see in the stacked bar charts, there's still a majority of assets invested in active investment products. And of course, an active investment product is one that's designed to outperform some benchmark, right? And if you look at the data of all active products, ESG and non-ESG, the record of active managers is not very good. Large majorities underperform their benchmarks, and in many cases they do so while assuming more risk than just a passive market or the passive benchmark. So it's reasonable to ask, are ESG funds underperforming their benchmark because they're ESG or because they're just like all the other active funds? And that's what makes this a little bit more murky. So I think that it's worth pointing that out. And I'd also say a couple other things that I think are interesting. It's mostly equities that are ESG related investments, right? There is a growing interest in fixed income and bonds, but for the most part, these are equity related investments. And we've done some survey work and worked with other organizations in the industry, just trying to ask why people are interested and who's really interested in this. And the left-hand side shows you a stacked bar chart by age cohorts, and who's interested. It's probably not going to surprise many people that younger people tend to be more interested in investing in a manner that's aligned with their values than folks who are older than them, right? A clear majority of younger people, which of course represents the largest growth in assets, are interested in ESG investment-related products. And when you ask them why they're interested in ESG products, or what types of products, I should say, the right stack bar charts, environmental concerns are still chief among them. Religious ones, Paul mentioned at the beginning of his remarks that the Quakers were one of the first organizations or people that invested in what are now called ESG products, but religious concerns are a smaller share. And governance is a smaller share too. And I thought I'd spend a moment on that one because I think that one's a little bit less understood. And I think it should be really uncontroversial, right? Arguably, the E and the S part shouldn't be controversial either, but the G part absolutely should not be. And so G just means governance. And when you think about if you are a company and people are buying your stock, they're giving you their capital. And you have governance basically means, practicing good governance means that you have a responsibility to be good stewards of their capital, to maximize the return on their capital and do so in a responsible manner. And there are certain indicators of whether or not companies are practicing good governance. And this is really all important because a lot of academic research by Vanguard and tons of universities, and the body of research on this subject is growing, is that there's a strong relationship between companies that practice good governance and their economic performance. Right? So when we think about good governance and what that means is the board of directors acting in the economic interests of the shareholders who provide them capital, or the bond issuers too, the bond investors. Are you paying your executives reasonably? And I specifically said reasonably because it could be different depending on the company. If you have one company that's performing twice as good as another, it's reasonable that their executives are compensated at a higher level, right? Is compensation reasonable between the executives and the rank and file workers? That's another sign of good governance. Is your board diverse? And when we say diverse, not just on characteristics like gender and ethnicity and race and other characteristics, but also just cognitive diversity is really important to us as well and is associated with strong corporate performance too, right? So if you look on a board of directors and everybody has the same last name, that's probably not a very good divorce board, right? And if you look at our board of directors at Vanguard, we have folks that are from academia, we have attorneys, we have people that have studied and are experts in organizational behavior. And as an investment management company, you probably aren't surprised to hear that we have some investment professionals as well on our board, right? So having a diverse board, making sure executive compensation is reasonable relative to the industry and as well as the workers in your company, and that shareholders are fairly represented. If you have executives and founders that collectively hold 10% of the stock, they should have 10% of the voting rights. Many cases you see them having majority shares in the voting rights, and that's not really equitable either. So when we think about ESG investing, we think at Vanguard is that it's a preference. It's still a fairly small portion of the investment universe, but it's increasingly aligned with strong corporate performance as well. So those are the end of my prepared comments, and I'll pass things to Jessica.
All right, before Jessica goes, I was gonna just give you guys a heads up. We're doing really good on time. You never know how long Paul's gonna talk when he gets up here, but Paul did a great job of being brief this morning. So we're doing great on time. So I'm gonna give you all a heads up. After our prepared remarks, before we go into our break, Paul and I thought it would be fun to just get your responses to each other's prepared remarks. So just be ready for that after Jessica goes. So I'm gonna hand it over to Jessica Uriegas from Ernst & Young for her prepared remarks. Go ahead.
Thank you, and again, really nice to be here with everybody. So I'm Jessica Uriegas. I'm a partner at Ernst & Young, and for most of my career, I've spent working with companies more in the financial reporting world. So I was 10 years as an auditor, and then a couple years as like more of a consultant, trying to get people through like IPOs and different kind of transactions, and through adoptions of IFRS and like other, just kind of more accounting changes. What's interesting is the last couple of years, like what Ernst & Young has done is because we saw a lot of the rules coming and potential for some of the ESG reporting becoming requirements and compliance, what we had to do was kind of like marry up like a couple different departments together. So I started working very closely with some of our climate change individuals, and for the last couple of years have like now been working with ESG reporting. So bringing more of like my background, which is financial reporting and controls, and marrying that up with people that are very familiar with the calculations of greenhouse gas emissions and more of that engineering kind of background. And why I kind of think that's important to mention is because as companies like Exequiel and team, like they're having to kind of bring together like different departments, different functions. Like companies are having to do this, so we had to do that internally within Ernst & Young also, to kind of help advise our clients mainly. We're at the forefront right now of a lot of change that's happening. For folks that are more on the finance side and have like dealt with reporting, what we're seeing now in ESG reporting and compliance, it's similar to the days of SOX, where Sarbanes-Oxley was first like implemented a number of years ago, or the worldwide kind of like IFRS like adoptions that happened a couple years ago also. For folks that are a little bit familiar with that, I mean, these are company-wide changes that need to happen because of the amount of compliance and reporting on ESG that's coming down. So I was going to highlight a couple of those like requirements that we're seeing more recently. Then I'll kind of share a little bit of like the questions and things that we're kind of working with on clients on their ESG reporting journey. And then talk a little bit about just a couple things to keep in mind as individuals, as you're thinking, if you're sitting within a business right now yourself, or if you are, obviously just working from an academia perspective, just to be aware, because these things, like I said, some of them have a little bit of a tail on them. So if you're still in school, then a lot of this would end up kind of coming out in a couple of years as people graduate. So let me kind of get into that with y'all. Because I'm at a big four accounting firm, this is our disclaimer that we have to put out there. So up on the screen, here's a number of different regulations. Now, this is not an exhaustive list because, like I said, there is tons of them. But that's what makes it complicated too, is that there's really not a really neat place of here's all the different rules and everything by country. And a lot of these rules are if you have more than a certain number of employees or more of certain revenue or assets or a combination of 2 or 3 of those criteria, then you actually have to start doing some reporting on them by country or consolidated. I mean, these rules are pages and pages and pages long. And again, there's not a really great place for this list of rules. But these are some of the larger ones that we see our clients dealing with. So the driving force for a lot of this has been in the EU. The EU put together a package called the EU Green Deal. And it is a comprehensive list of legislation, so a ton of different rules like within it. From a reporting perspective, there's a couple that really stand out. And the first one that's on here is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Now, for years, there has always been like reporting, like voluntary reporting, companies that want to share their greenhouse gas. Some of them even had it, like assured or audited. But there was not really really great rules. There's some protocol out there, but how you report it, who reports it, it was just a little mix, and it was voluntary. Now what this rule does is that it makes it mandatory. This is for companies that are in the EU, and you can be a US-based company, but you have a branch or a subsidiary, and it meets the criteria. There's certain criteria, but they're pretty low. Of doing, it's 50 million in basically revenue. So it's not the highest numbers that you would actually need to start doing this mandatory reporting. The reporting is a list of, it touches on governance of your ESG. It touches on your risk and opportunities that you would need to kind of share, like how are you addressing this? And then it kind of gets into more detailed topics on climate. So greenhouse gas and like some other transitional kind of risk. The reason I kind of say that is because there is a ton of other rules that have now come out on climate also. One here in the US, or actually a couple here in the US, and you'll see them out here in the fourth bucket. SEC actually issued a climate rule. And that was final in March, and then they issued a stay, which means due to a number of litigation that is open right now. So it's out there though, still, and it's kind of pending litigation results. So we haven't seen like the results of it, but the rule as it states is like reporting on climate. It's very heavy on climate in the US versus the E and some of the G. So there is some crossover between the rules, but what complicates this a little bit is that you could potentially, if you're a national global company, you could potentially have a ton of different reporting responsibilities, keeping different ledgers, keeping different like types of books, because of each of these rules are a little bit different, somewhat the same, a little bit different. So this is what makes it just very complicated. The other item on here really quick I wanted to highlight is the ISSB. This is basically IFRS, which has a special board that they set up for sustainability matters. Again, a lot of clients that are national report under IFRS, like globally. So the board basically prepared 2 standards so far. And those 2 standards include a little bit of risk and governance, and then it talks about climate. They understand that this is making it very complicated for people. So CSRD and the ISSB guys, they kind of teamed up, and they have an implementation guide to try to like minimize like having to have 2 sets of books. So I think that's really good, but there's still a lot to kind of be done there still. For both CSRD and ISSB, these are kind of, I'll call them like regulatory bodies, but they do not, both of those rules need to be basically adopted by the country. And so why that's important is because that the country itself can also kind of do something to, for instance, on the CSRD, they can do something called gold plating. And they could actually put additional rules atop of already the compliance that's out there already, even making it more complicated. So they could actually put additional rules on the amount of penalties if you don't follow it. They can change up some of the implementation timing. And then they could also change up to put some additional rules on the assurance requirements because, to clarify that point, assurance requirements of the like accounting firm or auditing firm that's going to do the assurance. So these are all like really hot topics because for companies that are trying to think about like, what's my plan? What am I going to do? I mean, imagine like having a roadmap with a ton of different regulations that some of them are still being debated, legally, like in the courts, but you need to kind of think about what your 5-year plan is, your 2-year plan, because these adoptions are kind of happening, or when you need to start doing the compliance in 2025, 2026, they all kind of have a little bit of different timelines, but most of the companies can't wait until then until the laws, et cetera, kind of get all finalized. So they're starting their plans now, kind of building the airplane like in the air to try to figure it out. And I loved hearing Exequiel's like your comments because you can get kind of mixed up into just thinking about this as a compliance project, which is like where I always ground myself because we're at the very intel of this process. We're thinking about the compliance and reporting. But ultimately, this is a real opportunity to kind of like embed the change into the company to kind of create long-term value. And that's how a lot of companies are thinking about it, and probably should, because compliance costs money. And you should be able to kind of flip this into a way to show the value of the company and different things that are happening. So let me just kind of look up here for a quick second to see if there's anything else I wanted to touch on. So the second and third one here, the second one is also wrapped up in the EU Green Deal. That one's kind of interesting. It has a little bit of a later implementation, but it's currently going through getting adopted by countries right now. So I mean, it's passed by the EU. That one's really focused on due diligence. So what it's going to do is basically for companies that are doing business in the EU, the thresholds are a little bit higher on this one. If it's about 450 million. So the EU expects about 50,000 people in the first one, the CSRD first column, that will have to do that reporting. The second one, they think about 10% will have to do the reporting because these thresholds are a lot higher. But this is going to mean that a company would go into their supply chain and really kind of put the policies and process in place to show how they're dealing with topics like human rights, how they're dealing with topics on governance and climate transitional risk, not just on their own process, but their value chain. And that gets kind of complicated because you can kind of choose your vendors, but that's a process that's going to affect a lot more than just those 5,000 companies. Because think about all the vendors and everybody else that's going to report up into those 5,000 companies as part of distribution or storage. It's because it's the whole value chain. And that could be a very big impact. So even though it's only 5,000 companies that will have to do that reporting, it basically affects like a whole ecosystem. And these are, again, this is EU kind of regulation, but if they're doing business with a downstream vendor in another country, it doesn't matter. If they're based in the EU, they have to kind of go and get this additional information. So a lot of companies, even though they're not directly impacted by this one, they will have to likely get some new questionnaires, get questions, and have to change policies themselves to comply. So there's just really huge impact changes. The third one on here, EU taxonomy. This is really to kind of like change up for greenwashing. So a lot of companies on their websites, oh, we do this, we plant trees, et cetera, carbon credits, the whole works. But what this does is try to kind of get away from, saying something a little different and kind of put metrics aligned to like certain activities. So it's a little bit of a couple step process, but basically what it'll look like is that you're going to have to report revenue, OpEx, and revenue, OpEx, and COGS for certain products that are related to, there's a whole list of these products that are out there in this EU taxonomy. And you have to report that information on how much expenses, how much like revenue was generated, like related to these products and activities that are listed out in the EU taxonomy. And this is like across industry right now. So it basically looks like a percentage. So we're doing really great, and then you show that you have 0% that's actually been paid into something like solar panels or renewable energy. So it'll be very clear on who's doing these activities and not. And that's the comment about greenwashing, is that you got numbers and metrics to kind of compare across industries. It's going to be a journey. And I think mostly everyone understands that those percentages are probably going to be zero or very, very low in the first couple years. But that's the kind of transparency of like, where do you start? And then like, how can you like do better unless you're tracking those, for companies are tracking it for themselves. This is also the reason for all this transparency is because it's trying to drive like investments. Like where, as an investor, a company can look and kind of make capital decisions. A company can make capital decisions. An investor can make decisions on like what companies they want to invest in, like based on this data that will be no longer voluntary, required to be shown. So it's really kind of changing the playing field. So I know that's a lot of data. And this is not even scratching the surface of the number that our requirements are out there right now. So journey. So like, where do you start with all this? Because like it's like mind blowing on the number of things that can be done and the number of things of people that need to get involved. So for the most part, we usually kind of talk about first kind of taking a look and doing a scan of like what's applicable for you, because it could be quite a bit of different rules, and that's usually the starting point, is like your disclosure strategy and then kind of looking at materiality. The fun thing about this is that there's different definitions of materiality like throughout all those standards too. So then there's like a reconciliation that needs to happen. But we usually kind of start with materiality assessments and then what rules are applicable for you. After that, you have to go and then start looking at your gaps. Like I said, it's a journey. A lot of companies, even if they were doing really great ESG reporting as is, like so a lot of people issue sustainability reports today. Again, most of that, or a lot of times what we've seen with companies is that it was kind of a behind the napkin, or like the support of the number was like emails and like discussions. And now that it's going to be required compliance reporting, which means that there could be litigation like and other things, those numbers need to be able to be very much supported, which is another reason why we started teaming up with some of our climate folks, because engineer folks, because of that strong background of like financial reporting and some of the SEC and controls. But so processes, controls, like all those things need to be in place for all those compliance numbers that were on the other page. So, and that's what I was talking about, like it's gonna just be quite a big change for different departments. And that, again, that's not in just financial reporting, that's like in the operations of the business. We also kind of put in here, because I don't want to like ignore it, is like kind of going back to like the organizational structure and design, because this isn't supposed to be just like a check a box compliance exercise. It really should be to kind of like help the company meet their strategic objectives too, and make decisions that are aligned to some of these ESG kind of topics. So we have that on there also. Couple of other things, the actual reporting, which there's tools and different things that are being developed, and there's a lot of evolution happening right now in the digital space for products. But then we get into assurance readiness, because most of those rules, great that we have a rule now, right, on different rules on how to do reporting, but there's like now assurance requirements on these, and they're all kind of staged in different things. But what that means is that you'll have like an assurance firm that would come out and then actually start looking at those numbers, ticking and tying, and like vouching it to support, which is another reason of needing the documentation and support on those numbers. So I'm kind of talking about the ugly side of ESG, all the controls and everything that are necessary. But absolutely, this is like what will need to be ready for getting ready for these assurance projects that are necessary to happen. I'm not going to go in detail on this one, but these are part of the exercises that would need to happen. Like these are a couple of different rules, climate-based rules that I've like passed and that companies are figuring out how to deal with. And you can see what we've done is kind of put them on different rows of like what are the requirements and then what's the necessity and differences. And there's differences between each of these lines. So I would love to say that if you just did a policy once, or you kind of like tackled it one time, it would be applicable for all of them, but it's not necessarily. So like when you go and develop a process, there needs to be little tweaks for each of these rules, or you could end up having like a ton of different processes, which would not work for a lot of companies. So maybe like lastly, what I wanted to kind of like comment with on a little bit is like, like as Exequiel was kind of mentioning on like the teaming that needs to be done here. I mean, we haven't seen a lot of things like this, in the last like 10, 20 years, like on this huge of an organizational change and like how it radiates across the company. And so a lot of people are obviously, it might start with your legal department or sustainability department if you have one, or even your financial like controllership office. But the folks that need to be involved are across the organization. And that's like, it's a real challenge like with companies. It's a challenge, for all of us, because people speak different languages, like their agenda might be different than your agenda. So really kind of getting cross-functional with the different like departments has been in itself one of the first steps to make sure you have the right people on like a steering committee or on a committee of like what's the next steps that we need to take here. The other thing that we would suggest companies to do is like really try to put an exercise together to understand what's applicable for you, because like I said, it is a lot of different rules that are out there right now, just a ton, and it can make it makes my head spin sometimes. So spending some time on your legal entity kind of scoping, and those rules are, a lot of them I said are like employee, headcount, it's revenue base, asset base. So knowing those numbers at a legal entity level across the globe is extremely important. I mean, we talked a little bit about like different EU, but there's also even local jurisdictions. UK was one of the first, but there's ultimately a ton of other like countries that have like come up with like different regulations. So it's a lot more complicated than what I've added on here. And then like I have the strategy on here also, because ultimately, to stay grounded on the fact that we don't want this to be just a like a rubber stamp, or we're doing this for the purpose of just complying and that's that. I mean, it really has to be more than that to kind of like give value back to the company and to be this long-term kind of value concept. And it's been proven to kind of shown that it can result in value for the company, either through trust or through being able to create more environment with your internal stakeholders, external stakeholders. And then lastly, what we also like people to kind of like remember is that there's a communication strategy here that also needs to happen. And this is a part of like bringing all these different groups together too, because you usually have like different like communication groups that are out there talking about the company a certain way, and your website and social media. Then you have the compliance reports that are going to start coming out, and then you have the investor calls and different areas. And really the ESG kind of like string needs to be consistent like throughout, like the value prop message and the messaging that's going out. Like I said, I mean, there is we haven't seen this a ton, but the potential for like litigation, just period, and what's being said, where it's being said, it could be quite high here. And so just making sure that the messaging in the whole ecosystem is like consistent is extremely important for the company strategy also. And so that kind of covers everything. Like I said, I can talk like 2 or 3 hours on this, but this was trying to keep it like high level because, I know a lot of y'all are kind of like newer, well, maybe newer to like the concept of like all these like international regs. So, please look us up on our website, because we have a ton of information and webcasts and different kind of podcasts like on these topics if you're interested to hear more. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jessica. Like I mentioned, I want to give the panelists a chance to sort of respond to what each other said. And I think a natural place to start would be, Exequiel, you told us about the journey that Peñoles went through. And Jessica sort of referenced that a few times. Maybe like, if you could say a few words about what she said about kind of this fire hose of regulatory and compliance stuff. Like, is this something that resonates with you?
Yeah, that reminded me of some of my nightmares. But no, what Jessica mentioned is really important, because part of the backlash of ESG is the greenwashing. And what we have seen is perhaps a combination of a good intent to have a good contribution of companies to sustainable development, but also how you could be more transparent and the information that you provide as a company is more reliable, and that could better off your shareholders, your potential investors, and of course the society that would like to learn more about the company and have trust of what the company is reporting on ESG aspects. So I would say that this is a big transformation for the companies, and what Jessica mentioned is we're going also through this reflection of what applies to us if we're in Mexico, but we would like to do business with the US or with Europe, but also we have subsidiary in the UK. So it's really to try to put the pieces together. What I would say is, and I would agree with Jessica, is that there is a compliance challenge that is really robust. But as a company, we should never forget why we're doing this. And we say, we're doing this on climate change because we know what are the potential impacts and we would like to do our part, but also because we can save money if we better design our facilities and if we adopt the technologies at the right time. Or likewise in water, if we have less water in Mexico, but I think my way of being more resilient in a more advanced way, if I start thinking of those ESG issues that I need to comply with reporting, but also look at them from a business perspective. How can I create value, become more resilient? You say, well, how are you going to put financial numbers on, the relation with an indigenous community? And that's always a debate. How can I put a number to that? But it's really easy when you have a conflict with a community and then you stop operations, then the financial numbers are really clear. But before that, it's really hard to say, well, is it worth it to invest in this kind of relationships, building capabilities? So that's the kind of reflections that the companies will need to do to connect all the points. But definitely, this aspect of compliance and how we manage internally the performance of ESG and the transparency is going to be one of the most important challenges that we face today in the sustainability departments of companies.
All right. Brian, do you have any reactions to either, from an investment standpoint, the journey that Exequiel described that Peñoles went through, or this regulatory compliance environment that Jessica was discussing?
I do. So whenever I think about ESG, I always think about it in the context of investment performance and investment outcomes for clients. And I also think of it in the context of, say, an athlete. My son is a competitive swimmer, and he gets up at 5:30 every morning and swims every morning, and then after classes he goes and works out. And it's hard work, as is adhering to some of these best practices of ESG is hard work, but at the end of the day, I think that it results in better outcomes. Training makes you a better swimmer, and I think practicing some of these standards of ethical conduct for a business makes them better businesses, better stewards of their communities, and more profitable. So doing good can also mean doing well. In most cases it does, and the research consistently shows that. But it's also tempting to cut corners, right? And firms like Ernst & Young ensure that companies can't really do that, or make it really hard for them to do that. And it's extraordinarily complex, and I'm glad you do it because I don't want to, right? But it's also, I think, really necessary to promote better investment outcomes. And at Vanguard and myself, that's what we're all about. We're always thinking about how can we produce better outcomes for investors to help them achieve their goals, to pay for college, to buy their house, to secure their retirement. That's what I think in investing, that's what this is all about. And I think investing with these kinds of principles, as I've said, the research shows, results in better outcomes. So if you take nothing away from this, at least from my comments, I think that, set aside some of the controversy and just remember that there's a strong and growing body of research that shows that companies that treat their workers well, that are good stewards of capital, that don't pollute the environment, they tend to do better.
All right, Jessica, before we go to our break, I want to give you a chance to respond to anything that your co-panelists have said so far.
Well, I definitely agree with your comment, because we have seen that, like, the companies that we're working with, or that we see, when we work with companies more from like an advising side to kind of like go through the journey, or we're helping on the assurance side, like doing the assurance. But normally these like early, I'll call them earlier kind of adopters, we usually see them as like companies that are doing, usually fairly well when we look at their stock prices and things like that. So it's just an interesting comment that I wanted to kind of make also. The other thing I wanted to comment on is, just you got to start the journey somewhere. So like Exequiel had a good example of like him starting his journey, it sounds like a couple years ago, but companies just need to start somewhere. And there's a huge amount of opportunity here for people that are just entering the marketplace, and opportunity for folks that have been in the marketplace for like a number of years, because there's not going to be, there's honestly limited talent too. Like there's different roles that are being developed here, because these roles are new, that didn't exist like 5 years ago, or didn't even exist like 2 years ago. So it's a really interesting and fun time to kind of be, I think, in this space, and to kind of lean in and kind of get involved on some of these rules and areas. So I just want to comment.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome point. Like, to your point about like, you just got to start, right? It's not like Peñoles or Fresnillo are new companies. They've been around a long time. And so even if a company's been around a long time, they can say like, hey, we're going to shift gears and prioritize new things. It's not like only new companies can say like, hey, we're new, we have these cool values. So that's a great point. All right, thank you all. What we're going to do next is we're going to move into a time for a break. Refill your coffee, use the restroom. Make sure you write down any questions you have on those cards, and please put them in the middle of your table. And where are Professor Melendez's student volunteers? We got some student volunteers in here. Would you guys please help me collect the cards from the tables and bring them over to table number 1 for me during the break? So we'll take 20 minutes, and then we'll come back and do our Q&A session. So enjoy the break. often at these events, what I try to do is take questions around a similar theme, sort of like meld them into one question that maybe encapsulates multiple questions that we receive. So a really great one that I wanted to start off with. This we have some that will be for individual panelists, but this one kind of is for all three of you, because I think it's a great question, and it's something that I've actually wondered about as well. I didn't write this question, but I could have. So the phrase ESG, environmental, social, governance, it's not always immediately clear, like, why do we put these three things together? Do we think that there's value in having these as like a lumped group, or would companies get more value from focusing on them individually without lumping them together as like a group of three things that may not necessarily always go together?
I can start. So, yeah, I always think about all types of questions like this in terms of, in the context of investment products, and I don't think they have to be lumped together. And in fact, if you look across the landscape of investment products, just like I use with my analogy of ice cream shops, there's different flavors of ESG. There's funds that focus strictly on the environment, and others that focus on religious aspect for catering to a number of different religions and their preferences, which are not common across the world's religions. So they don't have to be, but I think commonly when we think about ESG investing, they frequently are talked about as all three in common. I don't think, thankfully, I think we've progressed to a point where the G is common across most companies. You don't find too many companies that are like, yeah, we don't care about corporate governance, right? We were not interested in being good stewards of our shareholders' capital. But I think increasingly, while we talk about them as a collective, there definitely are different distinctions and flavors of ESG.
And speaking a little bit more from a compliance reporting perspective, we'll completely agree with all your comments. But in addition to that, a lot of the regulation is, I'll say the E in climate has been a little bit more focused on, because there's been a lot more scientific targets and measurements that you could really kind of like create a metric and then measure it and calculate it based on a certain format. So I will say that climate has been focused on, the environmental aspect has been focused on a little bit more because we could actually, really measure it and calculate it. But the other social aspects and some of those rules, again, from the EU, they're broad. They're very broad. And so they encompass everything. So while in the US, the rules that the SEC kind of put out and the rules that California put out, they were mainly climate and a little bit of governance. And I do think most companies do have some kind of governance structure, but they always don't necessarily report it like to the levels that we're now asking from these compliance rules. So there'll be some more of that, I think, in there. So probably doesn't exactly answer the question, like why do we always see them together? But I will say that different countries are focusing on different elements of it too, and it sounds like different investment kind of packages too. Anything else?
Yeah. I think that when you combine the three letters, it becomes more challenging for everybody. What happens sometimes in companies is that, the department was known as CSR department, corporate social responsibility, and then rebranded to sustainability, and then rebranded to ESG. But each time that you do this rebranding, you might need to take a deeper reflection of the number of topics that you're covering and all the implications, and to review the structure, because otherwise the companies are just tempted to change the name, but at the end of the day there are much more complex issues to manage every time that we decide to do these kind of big jumps in terms of how much is going to be covered at corporate sustainability. Nowadays, with all the reporting and the expectations of investors, insurance companies, and so on, it has become much more challenging to manage the three aspects together.
All right, Exequiel, we're going to stick with you. Speaking of challenging things to manage, we had a couple of questions that came in around a similar theme. So when a company undertakes a big cultural change like Peñoles has, it's kind of a two-part question. One, like what's the process that you experienced of shifting change within the company, shifting culture to an ethics culture within the company, and then how long did it take to get buy-in from the public and people in the community who interacted with the company once this shift started to happen?
It's an interesting journey. It began because in the UK, the corporate directors have an obligation to look at the culture of the organization and see if it is well aligned to the business. So it began that journey with a regulation that we needed to comply for the board of directors. But we ended up like saying, well, we need to comply with this, but at the end of the day, how we can make this useful, not only a compliance to say, well, the board of directors are briefed on culture, but actually how you could work with culture and have a transformation. So at the time, Fresnillo said, I need to comply with this, and Fresnillo said, well, what aspect of culture should I focus? And then we start looking at ethics. Ethics could be, the cornerstone, not only to comply with this, but also on many aspects where if you want to have good environmental performance or social performance, the ethical conduct of your people, managing the impacts, that's very, very important. So we start engaging our senior executives about these kind of programs, and then implementing the programs. And of course, when you are invited in Mexico to a course on ethics, you don't get that as good news. You say, oh my God, what happened? Why they're calling me to do this? But then the people start having fun, they get relaxed with the approach of Paul. They start to get relaxed, creative, and because people in Mexico think, no, I have been well raised and I have family values. So since I have good family values, that means I have good understanding of ethics for a company, but that's not the same. And the people go through the training, they find that is really important, to be accountable, to step up, and then you start seeing that the people in the back of their minds start taking this accountability, this ambition for stepping up to other aspects such as safety, environment, community relations. So it's like a slow progress where you get the people engaged in those aspects of culture, and then the people start taking that to their daily jobs. We measure that using the survey of Ethisphere, so that was the way we proved that it had an impact, and also using a survey that was developed by the university. But it's one of the challenging aspects is how to measure, and every time that you do something on culture, always think about measuring and actually try to link that to some business outcomes. Not just doing that for the pleasure of being ethical, but actually what are the business outcomes of this initiative.
And did you notice any differences, generational differences, as you're going through this program at the company? Were employees in different generational groups more or less receptive to these changes?
I would say that they were, all the generations were very receptive, and we had very interesting conversation across generations. Because now in the mining industry, we have a lot of very young people joining very senior people, and we have like a gap. People of my age are relatively rare in mining operations in Mexico because it follows economic cycles. So then we have holes in generations in mining in Mexico. But having those workshops and the young people engaging the senior ones and talking about ethics and really asking how we would solve this and that, the young generation and the older generation, that kind of conversations were fantastic, and it really was very good to have a better understanding of the expectations. So I would say it was well received. Perhaps the older generation was much more strict, and the younger generation was much more on the creative aspect of ethics.
All right, Thank you. Brian, we're going to shift the microphone over to you, but stick with the same theme of generational differences. In the investment space, do you see a difference in generations with respect to their acceptance and of the idea of ESG investing?
Yeah, so I shared some data on that in my presentation, but I think also the way younger folks think about ESG is different than it traditionally has been thought of. Right? Historically, Paul mentioned this in his opening comments, Quakers wanted to avoid sin stocks. So we think consuming alcohol is sinful. We're not going to own any alcohol companies. Well, increasingly, we were finding many people, especially younger folks, like, I kind of like alcohol. I like gambling, but I really want companies that promote inclusion and things like, are you extending banking services to lower income communities and to the developing world? Because we all know not having access to capital, being able to borrow money to go to school, to start a business is a great way to keep people poor, right? So I want to invest in companies that promote financial inclusion and promote access to health services. And at the same time, I still like going to casinos. So I don't want to exclude those traditional sin stocks. I want to actually invest in companies that are promoting positive change in the world and the environment. And so I think that the definitions and standards of ESG have actually evolved quite a bit. And so we're seeing less emphasis on some of those traditional areas like alcohol, tobacco, gambling, those sort of things, and more on inclusion, social impact, and the environment.
So moving away from what kind of things do I want to discourage, moving towards what kind of things do I want to encourage.
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly.
Very cool. Jessica, I'm going to shift to you. And you made a point in your presentation that compliance is typically seen as a cost center, but some companies are, like the real trick is to turn your ESG efforts into a value driver instead of just a compliance sunk cost. Do you have any examples of a company that has successfully been able to shift from this idea of, oh, we have to do this because it's compliance, to, oh, this is driving value for us?
Yes, and we're kind of a bit early on some of these CSRD concepts, but one I'll kind of come back to is related more to the social. So during like COVID-19, there was, obviously a lot of change that were happening, and you could see this with like a number of companies, but during those like investor calls, like after some of that COVID-19, you saw a lot of companies like shift what their talk tracks were, because they ended up talking more about what they were doing for the community, what they were doing for their employees, their community. So a lot more storytelling started happening. And storytelling alone is, that's good. But what they were telling a story of was like the value of what their products did, how their products performed, how they helped like the communities. And that actually, ended up being quite profitable for a lot of companies, not just because it was a part of like their strategy of how they started talking about their company. So for instance, you would see like products, for instance, on, even some of the, I think you were talking a little bit just about your own story, right? Like of the company story about the vaccinations. Like those type of things, other companies here in the US like did similar type of things like that. And they talked about them, and they ended up like pulling in specific people like to kind of share their story, and then you saw it splashed all over their websites, and it was included in these like investor calls. It's quite impactful, because if you look at how an investor call, when those earnings calls usually go, like 5 years ago, or I guess now 10 years ago almost, versus like when COVID-19 and right after was happening, they looked very different. It kind of starts with like a little bit of like, how's the business doing? A little just like historical, okay, let's just go back, let's look at what happened this last quarter, here's the numbers, blah, blah, blah. But instead, if you look at how investor calls have kind of like morphed now, it's a lot of storytelling. It's a lot about like talking about like some product that just came out and how it like changed X, Y, and Z, and like here's like a specific story on how we transformed another business, and now that business was able to provide hospital services to this whole community that would not have been able to do it without this like certain technology or certain product that they provided. So it was minor, but it was huge at the same time, because that was an example of like how people were like switching, like doing all those efforts and maybe making investments into these like different not-for-profits and whatnot, and causing it to like have a direct impact on the share price. So I don't want to name any companies in specific, but it's really, a couple started it, and now I think it's just like storytelling and that concept on earnings calls. It's quite like everybody. It seems like they're doing it.
You can name companies. We're all friends. Nobody's going to say anything. No, that's fine. I'm going to stick with you. And obviously you mentioned the regulatory environment around ESG is very complex and becoming more complex. this is a two-part question. Do you think there's a risk of sort of regulatory overreach here, regardless of whether it's the EU or the US or any other government? And do you think, like historically, there have been companies that have like relocated their tax status as a result of, trying to get favorable tax treatment. Do you think there's a time when companies do the same thing to try to avoid ESG regulatory issues?
Well, it's a good question, because originally when the EU was debating a lot of these rules for ESG and this like compliance in the EU-based companies were, this is not fair because we're going to have all these extra expenses, and yes, we want to do the right thing, but it puts us at a disadvantage to the rest of the world, basically. Meaning, like, is someone going to build a headquarter there, or are they going to just move it somewhere else? So they did try to like put in safeguards to kind of avoid people just kind of being strategic and moving things around. It's really, and these again are on a range, but those like standards, if you're based in the EU, you have to follow those rules, right? At certain thresholds. But also if you just sell into the EU, and that's a primary market for you, and there's certain like dollar thresholds, et cetera, but then you have to comply with these rules too. And that's the rule that kind of made it, well, yes, it's an EU rule, but like the whole world, if you want to do business in the EU, are going to need to like comply with it. And so that's how they tried to kind of make sure that some of the EU companies weren't at a disadvantage for these compliance requirements, et cetera. I will also say the SEC rule, there's a ton of litigation like out there right now. I do think there's obviously an election like coming up. Like those type of things will likely influence like the policy outlook of ESG, at least here in the US. Globally, there's a number of elections that are coming up for various countries. There's a lot of elections coming up. And so that will all kind of influence likely what the end kind of looks like here from like an ESG and what climate rules ultimately may end up. So, but at least for the EU, those rules are passed. Like, and most of the companies have already ratified or transposed them into local law. So it will impact everyone if you're doing business in the EU.
All right, thanks. Brian, question for you. I'm going to ask you to put on your prognosticating cap for a minute. And if you think about maybe over the next 5 years in Vanguard, where do you see ESG investing headed in the near term and maybe even into longer term after that?
Yeah, I think it'll continue to grow. And Jessica's kind of hinted at this. It is certainly true of investment products that in Europe in particular, ESG is widely accepted, much more so than it is in the United States. But we definitely see growing interest and demand, particularly from younger clients. We shared with you the data where about 2/3 of younger investors under 40 say it's very important for them to invest in a manner that's aligned with their personal values. Whereas as you get older, that the percentage tends to decline. And we think there's real staying power there. So it's still relatively small. I mentioned that it's less than 1% of all the assets invested in mutual funds and ETFs are ESG oriented, but I think that's very likely going to grow. I don't see it completely overtaking the market and becoming a majority, but certainly there's plenty of room for growth from less than 1%.
Okay. Sticking with you, if you've ever had clients push back on the idea of ESG or any of the three prongs of the ESG, what sort of response does Vanguard or you individually give to a client who might be wary or may have heard something, a political statement about the idea of ESG? Like, what's your response to something like that?
So we have 50 million clients at Vanguard. And when you have 50 million of anything, they represent every possible outcome, right? Every possible opinion is included in our investor base. And so you probably noticed I've tried to be really apolitical, because the first rule of presenting is don't anger your audience, right? And that's certainly true of our client base as well. They represent every point of the political spectrum, have every possible view on every subject you could possibly imagine. So when we talk about it at Vanguard, I get back to the points that I've I'm becoming a bit of a broken record, right? We do think that there is a strong relationship between ESG and positive outcomes for shareholders. And that's ultimately our end mission, not promoting as Arissa called it, a collateral benefit. We actually think you can do that while also achieving better investment-related outcomes for your clients without necessarily taking sides.
Very good, thank you.
Yeah.
Exequiel, next question's for you.
Thank you.
You know, mining is not only a big business in Mexico, it's a big business here in Arizona, and we have similar sort of concerns about it's the impact of mining on indigenous communities here in Arizona and also in Mexico. And a great question came in about if you could speak to sort of Peñoles' efforts to build trust with indigenous communities and this change that the company went through, how has that impacted indigenous communities in Mexico, and sort of what has that partnership looked like over the last few years?
Yes, it's an interesting challenge in Mexico. I mentioned that Mexico signed an international agreement, the ILO 169 agreement on indigenous peoples, that talks about consultation. Mexico took time to start implementing this regulation, and we were the first to go through this process for the mining industry. And it was, we worked with authorities, with the communities, and it was a good collaboration that allowed the company to show what were the potential impacts, how we intended to manage them, and then collect the feedback of the community, and to build trust on the construction of that water dam. I think there are many challenges to implement the process, but in Mexico and in the US, we would expect companies and the governments to develop the capabilities to run these kind of processes. It generates value to the projects in general. I would say that if all the questions you have, you can address them before start building, then the construction process is going to be much more on schedule. And you know that those big investments, the first few years are the most important for your NPV. So if you want to have a project that goes on a schedule and you really would like to engage your communities proactively, well, chances are that you reduce the social risk of the project. But to do that, you need to engage early and do that consistently. We have seen that that creates value. We have only one case where we have been mandated to do that. But of course, expansion projects of Fresnillo and Peñoles might require these kind of consultations. But we're convinced that if we work these kind of processes in good faith, and if we do the good preparation and engage authorities, these kind of processes create value for everybody, for the communities, the company, the shareholders.
All right, I'm going to stick with you for the next question. Peñoles' journey over the last few years with its ethics culture largely was not the result of government enforcement, right? Like the Mexican government didn't come to you and say, like, you guys have to do this. It was there were other motivating factors. Do you think that created more buy-in, or would it have been different if the company's journey had been a result of government enforcement action in Mexico? Does that make sense?
Yes, it's. I mean, the new regulations are intended to push this kind of transformations in the companies. So when you have these new regulations about IFRS or those European directives, are really like I'm gonna regulate the companies and try to push this transformation. The other alternative is really about leadership and the purpose of the organizations. And I think that nowadays we're going to see the two approaches like merge. It's very important that the leaders of the company are committed to what are the important sustainability aspects for the stakeholders and the business. It's like we could have 200 sustainability issues, but we really need to identify those that are material, as Jessica has discussed. Which ones are materials? Well, the ones that make sense for the business and the ones that are, aspirations or concerns of the stakeholders. And if you identify those, well, you can develop proactive initiatives, and then you have, more information and more of the necessary aspects that you need to report under these new regulations. So I would say, Michael, that it requires a combination. So often there are changes that are created by regulations, and that has been demonstrated. And there are also changes that are created by leadership, vision, and companies will live with those kind of things. What I've just mentioned of Peñoles, there were things that were triggered by regulations, but then they were easily captured like leadership aspects, and things that were pushed by leadership, and then when the regulation came, we were better prepared. So I think both ways are going to be there for a while, and it's important to keep those aspects into consideration.
Thank you. Next question is for Jessica. In your work with clients at EY, what has your experience been with, I'm trying to combine several questions here in my mind, but they're all on the same topic of like the cost associated with this compliance. Obviously, we've talked about like we can shift it into a value driver, but there's still costs. And like, what magnitude of cost are we talking about when you had that slide up with all those different regulatory frameworks? Like, how much of a burden is this for companies as they navigate this process?
Yeah, the EU actually did some studies where they put out the potential cost to comply. So there's like some numbers out there on the EU website. And I would say that we haven't seen a ton of companies go through the entire journey yet, because this is still kind of new. Usually companies are kind of in the starting stages of like assessment and kind of like getting an understanding. Those are usually a lot cheaper, type of projects, because it doesn't involve like a huge amount of transformation, yet. And a lot of these like costs are being bore quite internally, like with the company trying to do a lot of the legwork of like bringing all these different groups together, and like the project management of hosting these like number of different projects. So, but they do believe, like if you look at the EU website on like the potential cost to comply, I mean, there's quite a significant cost to comply here. And that's why it just makes it even more important to kind of have like the value prop of like, we're going to have these costs to comply because you need to do it. It's a compliance if you're in those like certain jurisdictions. But then how can you derive cost value out of it at the same time? Because the cost, you're going to have the cost out there just to do business in certain areas like the EU. So what can you get out of it? Like, how can you kind of balance your business case to kind of show a lot of value, and you're not just spending money to kind of collect the data, collect the metrics, install new systems. Instead, it could be more of positivity of the long-term value, et cetera, to build these business cases. So I would encourage folks, like if you're at the onset, the EU site that they have set up, it does have some like cost to comply like data that they did while they were trying to collect and really kind of think about balance like these rules. And they did put it out there, and they did kind of put transition plans so that it's not, at the end of this year everything's required, or into next year everything's required. There's a lot of like phases that the rules kind of go through.
All right, thanks. I have one last question for Brian, and then a question for the group, and then we're going to wrap it up after that. So, Brian, the question for you is, you mentioned that there's very strong evidence that governance is a good driver of performance and value. Is the governance driving all of the success in ESG investing, and the E and the S are just kind of like along for the ride, or do they also produce individual value on their own?
Oh, no, I think they definitely do. I mean, I think the classic example of not practicing sound, it's just focusing on the S, is the tobacco industry. Right? I know that I'm not the only person over 50 in this room, and those of us that are in that age group remember that probably half your friends smoked back in the 60s, 70s. I'm not going back that far to the 60s, but some of you I can see are. But you know that you could smoke anywhere. You could smoke in hospitals. You could pretty much anywhere but church, airplanes, right? It was a wildly profitable industry, and at least certainly judging by today's standards, they didn't practice sound governance or social practices, right? They were marketing to children, and they were denying that there were health impacts to smoking. They probably didn't know at first, but even when they did, they're like, oh, let's keep that quiet, right? And what resulted is eventually, when society learned how damaging smoking is to your health, there was a massive settlement that I think was over $800 billion with the tobacco industry, right? And so that's an extreme outcome, but I think you can see the potential pitfalls of not practicing, not just sound governance, but just ethical business practices, right? And there's dozens and dozens of other examples, but that's perhaps the most extreme one. So certainly governance is really important, but being a good actor in your communities in a lot of different ways can drive shareholder value or destroy it if you don't.
All right, great. And then this last question is for the whole panel, and has to do with competitiveness. So much of what we talked about has been, the ESG regulation or efforts being made in North America, the EU, places like that. But many industries are global industries these days. Mining, very global industry, happens in many countries, including a lot of countries that don't have a lot of firm regulations in this field. Do you think that either increased regulation or just voluntary action of firms to promote ESG is, on a global scale, helping competitiveness, or does it cause a firm to perhaps fall behind in global competitiveness?
I guess I'll start and then I can pass it to colleagues. I definitely think there is a cost. Jessica's done a great job of explaining that and the challenges of complying with some of these rules. But I think certainly being globally competitive requires many firms to practice sound governance and just ESG practices in general. And while a lot of my comments have focused on explicit ESG-oriented products, if you talk to almost any asset manager, they all are thinking about ESG in terms of driving value, even if they don't have an explicit ESG mandate. They want to know that a company practices good governance and doesn't become the next victim like the tobacco industry, right? And so I think to be globally competitive, increasingly companies have to do this. There is, again, a very strong alignment between doing good and doing well as a company in terms of profitability and operating efficiencies.
I agree with that. And in addition to that, I think that the EU taxonomy will kind of help drive some of the comparisons that you're going to see between companies in the same industry. So you'll have like a side-by-side with peers on like, well, who, put your money where your mouth is, like who actually did this and who actually like spent money, whose products are aligned in a certain way. It will drive like competitiveness for sure when you start looking at like industry peers and they're back to back together. Now, the worst case scenario would be that everyone just kind of stays at like 0%. But what usually happens is there's like one or two like leaders like amongst that kind of like help pull everybody else along. And we definitely see companies like that, that are just, they're doing it because of like sound like CEO leadership, and then it just radiates throughout the company. Yes, it's a compliance, but they're really kind of like unlocking like that stock, the shareholder value and societal kind of value. So those kind of companies, once they're in these industry pools, and then you can see like all the other companies like next to it, I think that'll like just drive the peers to kind of like catch up with some of the others.
Oh, can I hop in before you do it? Sure. And I'd love to see if this is true or not. I read a case study that once said Chevy has a car called the Nova. I don't know if they still make it or not, right? And as they're expanding globally, they said, let's sell this car in Latin America. And of course, Nova in English means no go, right? Right? It's probably not, who's going to buy, what Spanish-speaking person is going to buy a car that doesn't go, right? And so I think that is another example of how you're become globally uncompetitive if you don't promote diverse cultures, if you're not thinking about people outside of your common interaction, your common circles, right? I think if it's true, one of the funnier examples of not promoting diversity, inclusion, things like that as well. So I know your thoughts on love, is that true?
Yes. I mean, something that is really relevant for international companies is on social and environmental aspects is how you have like an ambition and what are the kind of best practices that you would like to implement. Imagine that if you operate in 10 different countries and then your environmental performance is going to be very different in each country depending on how permissive or how mature is the regulations there. Then when you would like to assess how the company goes in terms of environmental performance, it's not possible. It's not going to be possible. So these regulations are very useful in terms of transparency and accountability. But companies have been for a while having this reflection that I cannot, like having an arbitrage on the environmental regulations and say, if I operate in Africa and there's no regulations about health and safety or environmental, water aspects, if you take advantage of those, at the end of the day, you're much more exposed to risks and then scandals, controversies. So the companies, especially the leading companies, have been reflecting on that and saying, well, let's have best practices that could work on different jurisdictions and then stick to these kind of best practices that we know that are good to manage the risks associated with our activities and to create opportunities. So this reflection inside the companies that do that are going to be much more prepared to those regulations that are coming. And the companies that usually have this kind of approaches it's easier the conversation with the investors. We often have conversations with insurance and reinsurance companies that say, well, I'm not very interested if you comply with the Mexican standards for tailings. I'm much more interested if you comply with international ones. So at the end of the day, many things are like aligning, and the internal considerations of the company about best practices is valued also for other shareholders, stakeholders. So this is going to be something that is going to merge, but at the end of the day, always the compliance with the leadership aspects, they need to go together in order to be successful as a company.
All right, thank you all. Panelists, you're off the hot seat. You made it. Big round of applause for our panelists. So I'm going to turn it back over to Paul for some closing remarks.
All right. Thank you, Michael. So again, big thank you to our moderator, big thank you to our panel, big thank you to all of our guests, our team members, which made today possible, and of course, our very generous sponsor, Doug and Claudia Zanes. Big round of applause. We have a very small token of appreciation that we'd like to give each of our panelists. So
Thank you.
please
Thank
take
you.
your gift.
Thank you.
I want to just share a real quick experience I had. And I think it really is going to drive home the point here from what we've learned today from our panel. Just last month, I had a chance to take our executive MBA class after I taught them a course on leading organizational change to Austin. We always like to pick cities that are up and coming, right? They have great opportunities for entrepreneurs, startups, venture capital. And one of the companies that I had just been hoping for now 2 years to be able to connect with was a company by the name of Natera. If you're not familiar with Natera, I would encourage you to look into them. Natera is a startup based in Austin, Texas. They do essentially genetic testing. They're a biotech company. I designed a hackathon for our executive MBAs. We had a full day with the company executives. They got to go meet the senior leadership, see the actual a hairnet experience of a biotech company. And then I put them to work for about 3 to 4 intense hours where they had to do an analysis, they had to do presentations to the senior board. And I broke the news to them. I said, somebody's going to win. And I'm not going to be the one that decides. It's going to be the senior leadership. So in developing this hackathon with Natera, I'd done my background, my research in the company. And this is a company that is really kind of the living embodiment of ESG. And what I mean by that is their build is LEED certified, and they're already net neutral. From a social standpoint, they're doing DNA cell-free testing, which is very interesting, right? It's a new technology, but it's got some ethical precepts there. And from a governance standpoint, well, they learned from Theranos. Their board actually has real scientists. They have people from the government, the nonprofit, academic sector, but also people that are make up kind of the constituent of their market base. So when I was developing for the senior leadership a menu of topics that I could deploy our MBA students to do this hackathon on, I did not include ESG. And in the 11th hour, I thought, maybe I should. They won't take it. They did. So of course I get nervous. I'm like, oh boy, I've taught them, but I had no idea. And we're gonna find out in a real market sense. They really excelled. One team won, and I wanna share why they won. They rolled out a tremendous presentation, but you know what their value proposition was? They said to the senior leadership, we're acknowledging everything that you've done, all the targets that you have short, long term. There's one area though that we think that you can capitalize on, an opportunity that is yet realized. We want you to consider creating a foundation whose purpose and mission will be to get your wonderful genetic testing, which by the way is for women's health, to some of the poorest, underserved in society. When they made this pitch, it was awkward. There was a quiet. I didn't know quite how to read that. I later found out it struck a chord with the entire senior leadership. They said we had thought about this, but it was 10 years down the road, but we had never really thought of it in that way. What our students did essentially was lay out a very good argument for strategic corporate social responsibility, which we have talked about earlier, related to but different from other discussions like sustainability. That's probably another discussion for someday, right? All of these interesting initiatives and how they relate. But I wanted to share that with you because it is happening, right? And whether you're a mining company that's over 100 years old or a startup company, right? Or somewhere in between, I think what we said earlier is still the case, right? Leaders today are going to have to deal with the politicians and the investors, but the expectations of society are just going to continue to rise. And so are the demands of investors. So I hope today was a good day for you. I hope today as you leave, you feel like you understand this topic a little bit better than when you arrived. But the key is to continue the conversation. Continue the conversation today into next week and make the commitments, right? Make those commitments. The last thing I want to invite everyone to participate in is if you enjoyed today's Executive Ethics Symposium, in just over a month, we're going to be doing our 22nd annual Collegiate Ethics Case Competition. This is the biggest thing in the world. I'm not kidding. Every top business school from Canada, the United States, and Mexico comes. And when UT Austin sends their business students, they are the very best business students. We would love to have our guests here consider joining us as judges. You made the reference a little earlier, Brian, about you're not the only one that's 50 in the room. This is the fountain of youth for all of you over 50. Come to campus, you immediately get younger. When you start seeing the ideas and seeing these students, you're like, I'm ready to come back to college, right? But it's an amazing experience, and we want to make sure that you know that we are always looking for judges. It's a wonderful experience. Nobody knows what the topic is except for a few of us. This year, we're going to really throw a little bit of a curveball. It's going to be on lab-grown meat. Think about the stakeholders, the economic opportunities, the financial gains, the legal, regulatory environment, the ethical questions, right? And I think it's going to be a wonderful experience. So again, thank you for being here today. Enjoy the rest of the day and the weekend, and we hope to see you here very soon. Thanks again, everyone. And with that, that is the end of our program. Have a wonderful weekend.